Think back to just 5 years ago. How different was the world and the workplace then? Very few workplaces had hybrid or remote work arrangements. The most we used AI was Siri on our iPhones, and we expected one or two big changes a year at work, but that was about it. In just 5 years, so much has changed in the workplace, and it just keeps changing faster and more frequently than ever before. And for communication professionals and change managers and leaders, that means we need to change our approaches too. Because not only has the world around us changed, but the way people respond to change is starting to shift as well. So, what can we do differently? That's a question I asked today's guest, Kate Neilson. Kate is a content creator with over a decade of experience producing content for a range of diverse clients from all walks of life. She is a senior editor at Mahlab, a global business communications agency that is headquartered in Sydney. And that's where she works on a range of different clients, including leading the publications and podcast of the Australian HR Institute. In this role, she has developed a personal passion for writing about all things work and is especially interested in exploring how employers and employees can adapt to a rapidly changing world of work. Now, Kate has the great privilege of being able to talk to people from so many different organisations from all over Australia as part of her job, which means she really has her finger on the pulse of what's happening in workplaces and what's happening with change and comms. And I first met Kate at the IABC APAC Fusion Conference a few months ago, where she presented on the topic of change apathy, and I knew I had to pick her brains more. So I invited her on the podcast, and in this episode, she shares a wealth of knowledge on the state of play in workplaces, what's working, what's not, and she shares her own framework to create change communications that actually work. So, without further ado, here's Kate. Kate, welcome to Less Chatter, More Matter.
Thanks for having me, Mel. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, me too, especially after we met in Manila at the IABC APAC conference. I knew I wanted to pick your brains more. But before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about you? What do you do? How did you come to develop your expertise in that space?
Yeah, for sure. So I am a senior editor and content strategist at Mahlab. So we're a global business communications agency headquartered in Sydney, Australia. So I've been here for around 7 years and written a variety of different types of content for a bunch of different clients from sectors far and wide. But the stuff that really energizes me and excites me is writing all about things work related. So part of my role at Mahlab, and one of the hats that I wear is being the editor for the publications of the Australian HR Institute. So that means I have the privilege of speaking with business leaders and HR leaders about all of the really interesting strategies and things that they're doing to kind of try and prime and prep their workforce and work practices for this really ever-evolving world of work that we find ourselves in. So it's certainly been a really fascinating time for me to write about work over the past 5 years. As I'm sure you can imagine, there's plenty of fodder and lots of change, which that's kind of just what I was excited about diving into professionally and personally, was just how do we help people to navigate this change? We're thinking about work now versus 5 years ago. They're chalk and cheese. And, that's not something that a lot of people experience, is being able to, say that the way they work is completely different than it was 5 years ago. So I find that really fascinating. I'm really glad that this professional world is where I spend my time, because I think being a communicator or an effective communicator has never been more important. I think we've well and truly busted this myth that communication is somehow a soft skill. I hate that phrase.
Me too.
I think we really need to talk about the fact that it's a superpower, and being able to do it well is something that boards and executives and stakeholders and clients, finally it feels like we're all on the same page and saying this is a really, really critical skill for you to develop, and it helps the business move forward.
Yeah, it is absolutely essential. So how did it come that you ended up at Mahlab? What was your journey up to that point?
The journey up to that point, well, to be quite frank, I was in industries I didn't find very interesting. I was spending some time, not to offend anyone listening, but I was spending some time writing about the finance industry, and it was just something that I couldn't wrap my head around. I didn't find a lot of excitement and enjoyment around it. And to be honest, I kind of just moved from a place of just wanting something fresh. And then when I came to Mahlab, they said, "Oh, you're going to write about HR." I was like, "Oh, that sounds boring as well." And then I started doing it, and I was like, I could not have been more wrong. This stuff is fascinating. It's all about humans. It's all about human intricacies. Yes, there's the policies and the processes. That doesn't, that's not always exciting, but important. But writing about humans and the things that businesses struggle with, I think, is just such an honor because, we've seen content around work just become a lot more common. And I think people are finding it more interesting because everyone is touched by these changes in some way. So stuff that I'm writing about, yes, it's for HR, but I think anyone can kind of pick parts of it that will be relevant to their world as well.
Yeah. And there's, like you mentioned, the last 5 years has been nuts. If you just stop and think about it, pandemic, hybrid work, political changes, we've had technology changes, AI springing up out of everywhere, the actual workforce is changing. What are some of the key trends you've seen emerge in the last 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, you're so right in saying that change is everywhere. I think we, obviously you and I met at the IABC Fusion Conference, and one of the things I spoke about there was a quote that someone said to me, what I heard at an event, which was that change is accelerating faster than ever before today, yet today is the slowest it will ever be. And we've heard a lot of iterations of that quote since then, but at the time for me, that was a real light bulb moment. I was like, oh my gosh, yes, we are just living in this world where today feels overwhelming and tomorrow will be even more overwhelming. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm hearing from business leaders and HR practitioners is that, their people feel like they're just exposed to so much newness. I mean, technology is the obvious one. I think there's a platform for everything now. And quite often we have one challenge we're trying to solve and we plug 10 different pieces of technology into it. And that's, creating complexity that we don't necessarily need. But I think a lot of the change that people are struggling with, it's happening a little bit more deeply on a personal level of how do we develop resilience to, difficult news or difficult situations that are springing out of work around restructures and people losing their jobs or personal financial challenges that kind of come on the fringes of our work experiences. There's a lot of hard, tricky stuff around mental health. I think that's the stuff that HR people in particular are obviously expert at dealing with, but it doesn't make it any easier. So, it's this relentless, uncatch-upable feeling of change that employees just aren't built for knowing how to, humans, I should say, aren't built for these never-ending change cycles. That's something that you spoke about at the conference, we have brains that aren't necessarily made for the millions of notifications and emails and training courses and news articles that we are exposed to every day. So I think that's it's a really important thing for businesses to be paying close attention to and thinking about because it's a foundation of how work gets done and productivity happens. If people are feeling flap and overwhelmed all the time, how can we expect progress in our organizations?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's the overwhelm is huge. And I think we've touched on a little bit of this already, but in your conversations that you're having with businesses and professionals from around the country and your colleagues who are working in different industries, what are some of the common issues you're hearing about the actual change experience for employees, how that's being managed?
I think there's a communication piece at the center of all of this. I think quite often, and I know we might speak about this in a bit more depth later, but we're really reverting to perhaps traditional approaches that might have worked well even 5 years ago, but 10, 20, 30 years ago, there was a strong sense of being quite directive and being quite top down. And there are circumstances where that type of communication is really effective. Someone said to me once, to use the analogy of, if there's a fire, you don't want someone to empower you to find the exit. You want them to tell you how to find the exit pretty quickly. So there is a place for that type of stuff. But I really do think that we need to think about how we can bring people along on the journey and use language that makes them feel part of what's going on. And I think that's what's been missing for a lot of people at the moment is that they just feel like they're being, directed to do X, Y, Z, and perhaps they don't necessarily have the underlying message of here's how that benefits you. So that's where at the conference I was talking about belonging comms and, the importance of being a bit more inclusive in our language, which I can go talk about more now if you like, or we might have another question in between that.
Yeah, well, I know when you talked about the belonging comms, it was in the context of this idea of change apathy. So I hear a lot, change resistance, change fatigue. What is change apathy? How is that coming about? What kind of impact is that having?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just quickly give some context and a couple of quick data points just to set that up, because I think this is a concept that came from an interview that I did with an expert at Gartner. And I do think they are the experts. They're people I turn to for all the data on change. I mean, they're doing such great work. And they found that in 2016, the average organization was experiencing just 2 what they call unplanned enterprise-wide changes per year. So that's something like having a new leadership team come in, restructure, big tech implementation, something that's going to kind of rock the boat a little bit. And then in 2024, so less than 10 years later, the average organization experienced 12 of those changes per year. So it's like a pretty massive shift. And like in some respects, that's to be expected. We are talking nearly a decade on. Obviously, work is becoming more complex. Change is always expected. Probably important to say, change is often good. I'm not here saying change is bad. I think it's just how we talk about change sometimes isn't necessarily effective. But what Gartner found at the same time as that is that employees, they found a correlation between the amount of change the average employee is exposed to and their willingness to embrace that change. So in 2016, that was sitting at about 70% or around the mid-70s of employees who said, yes, I'm willing to jump on board with this change that you're putting forward. Whereas now in 2024, that data was sitting at about 40%. So, less than half of the workforce who are saying, hey, yep, I'll be involved in this change. And this is change that businesses spend millions of dollars, thousands of, resources trying to get across the line. And then it's just not cutting through. So this is kind of what's leading up to that, that change apathy that we spoke about and that Gartner is kind of talking about, which is, it's not just the change fatigue that we're tired of change. It's people are saying, I don't care about this change. I don't want to be involved. I'm kind of passively part of it. So in some respects, we do have those passive observers of change rather than those active participants, which are what, businesses really, really need. And that undermines transformation efforts in a huge way. There's poor adoption, there's late, missed deadlines or KPIs, innovation stalls off the back of that. People just don't want to put their hand up with a new idea or a new way of doing things. We kind of bunker down to protect ourselves a little bit. And then off the back of that, the ripple effect is, there's trust that is eroded and loyalty that declines and all these terrible things that, you just don't want in your business. And Gartner found anecdotal links between change and people's propensity for misconduct. So, it's rewiring how we operate and show up at work, which, as I said before, is something that we need to be taking really seriously.
Yeah, 100%. And then I guess that then leads to, okay, well, if we're seeing this change apathy and yes, it's almost a decade ago, but realistically, when you think about the history of humanity and so fast and how quickly this has moved. And to your point earlier, you said, a lot of communicators and change people are still relying on the same old approaches. So you've talked about the concept of belonging communications and how they can be used as a strategy to address that apathy that we're seeing. Can you tell us a bit more what you mean by belonging communications?
Yeah, for sure. So I think if we look at traditional change communication, it's often all about what the business wants to get out of the change. So we want you to learn this new tech platform. We want you to do this new process. They're not necessarily doing the work to connect the dots between how this might impact an individual, impact them in a positive way or a negative way. Like, doesn't necessarily matter. It's just kind of bringing them into how this will change your work experience in some way. So belonging communications is really about how we can flip that lens and make employees feel like they're part of that process rather than just being on the receiving end. So this is a way for you to kind of ensure that your message not only reaches people, which is the traditional approach, which is obviously important, but then resonates with them, which is what we need for that sustainable long-term buy-in of a change. Because, obviously, as you would know, change isn't something we can just flick a switch on and it happens. It's that you need communication and processes that span months, even years sometimes for some workplace changes to actually stick and implement and be effective. So at the conference, I kind of shared a slide that looked at the difference between traditional and belonging comms. And I think that's something you mentioned we might be able to pop into the show notes for
absolutely.
people. But part of that is looking at things like, rather than top-down updates, it's two-way dialogue that invites input. One part of that graph that I think is really important is inviting curiosity instead of assuming resistance, because I think quite often in traditional approaches, even if we're not explicitly saying it, we're coming from the perspective, and we in this instance being the employer, of assuming that people aren't going to like the change that we're putting forward. And I think that just colors how you talk about it and almost plants the seed for the receiver of that message to be resistant. So instead, if you're demonstrating that curiosity approach, it's about saying things like, hey, we're making this change in a couple of months. Like, would you like to learn more about it? Would you like to be involved in it? Would you like to be part of a pilot program that gives us some feedback on it? You're bringing them in, and the outcome is the same, or the outcome is what you originally wanted with the traditional approach, but it's just a bit more of a human-centric way of bringing people along on the journey. And I think, it's a subtle shift, but an important one and impactful.
Have you seen any organizations doing it really well?
I'm sure there are many people that are doing it really well. So the fact that I can't bring one to mind right now doesn't mean there isn't. But I do think the thing about the people I'm speaking to are the people that are experts in this space. So my lens is a little bit colored in that sense. So I speak with a lot of consultants and a lot of businesses that are saying, this is how we approach things. Whereas their sentiment, some of the things I'm hearing from them is that this is not what everyone is doing, because quite often during times of disruption, we reach for familiar things that worked in the past. And so it's a bit challenging, because I think you do have to, as the internal comms person or as the HR leader, whoever it is that's kind of spearheading this, you do have to challenge a lot of other C-suite peers of yours who do hold that view of the old way is the best way. And it goes back to kind of what we were saying before of how do we bust this myth that communications is a soft skill or a soft profession. It's showing up and kind of saying, hey, the results you want are X. The risk that we have if we don't bring our people along on the journey is millions of dollars down the drain, millions of wasted hours, kind of building that business case up to demonstrate the impact of poor communication in that sense. It's about positioning ourselves that way. So there are a lot of people that will be doing that, but I'm quite often speaking to those that are coming in to help people do that who aren't.
Well, it's good to know that there are people helping others do it. So that's good.
Exactly.
And one of the things you did talk about was the BAR framework, BAR. What is that? How can we use it to make our change comms more effective?
Full disclosure, it's I pulled this together to collate the information. So this was something that I made up, but
I like it.
I do still think it's really
frameworks
useful.
all the time. It's fine.
Yeah. It's about making communication accessible, right? So the BAR framework was pulled from a lot of the conversations I've been having with people. So it is backed by a lot of other experts, but the B stands for be real. So that's about how can we avoid corporate jargon? How can we avoid making messages overly complex for no reason? Jargon makes people feel a bit alienated. It makes them feel like you're talking about the business, what the business wants, not about them. B, sometimes they don't understand it, so your message gets lost. C, people feel like you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes when you're, cloaking messaging in a lot of unnecessary jargon. I often think back to a conversation I had with an employment branding expert, and we were talking about, how can you get your job ad to stand out in, a sea of LinkedIn jobs. He said, I always add a section in my jobs that says, here's why you might not like working here. And he'll list, we are a hardworking culture. We push people, or you might find that our ways of working don't necessarily align with you, or he kind of just goes through a list of things. And he says, that's a way to get the people that you want to apply, but also to just leave a better impression with people, because you kind of think, okay, cool, I'm not going to waste my time in applying for this because that's not the role for me. But, you've been authentic. So I think that authenticity piece is really, really critical in communication and kind of lines up with that belonging and inclusive language that we use. A is about anchoring in relevance. So that's the what's in it for me factor, and showing employees, as I said before, how it could benefit them positively as well. So I think sometimes the argument that comes up around the what's in it for me is the whole, oh, Gen Z employees wanting all this stuff that they can't have, which again, it's another thing I just don't really like hearing, because I think it's much more complicated than that. Work is becoming more transactional. That's just a fact. So that's the anchoring in relevance. And then the last one, the R, stands for reinforcing stability. So I think this is a really, really critical and sometimes underrated part of an internal comms person job. It's how can we actually create pockets of stability for employees? How can we be a buoy for them in a storm? How can we create that moment, even if it's small, that moment that gives them a little bit of autonomy, a little bit of control over a situation that otherwise might have felt completely out of their control. And that can be really powerful in helping to get them on side. So, I think at the conference, I used the example of a lot of return to work mandates that are coming in, and businesses, for whatever reason, it's a reasonable thing to ask people to do, but it comes with a lot of emotion because we feel very protective of our right to work flexibly, specifically here in Australia. So if that's something you are doing in your business, how can you talk about the other things that aren't changing? We are still allowing you to pick your start and end times. We're still open to having conversations about individual flexibility plans. We're still doing X, Y, Z. It might seem like obvious stuff, but you do have to say things over and over to people to remind them what they are still getting and what's not changing. So I think that's something that we really need to be focusing on as comms professionals, and that business leaders need to make sure that they're also factoring into their changed communication as well.
Yeah. And I was so glad when you said that, because it's something I do bang on about a bit, and listeners on this podcast will know, any of my clients will know, you have to talk about what's not changing, not just what is changing. And part of that, as we talked about, is the overwhelm. When there's so much going on, people just need something to anchor to that is staying the same sometimes. And it's because we love the status quo. Status quo is comfortable. And there's that whole idea of, prospect theory, where even if the change could be better for us, if there's a risk attached to it or an unknown, we're still more likely to not go for that change, because we will prioritize a safe bet over something that has a little bit of unknown, but it could be better for us, which is, human beings. We're interesting like that. You did touch a little bit on this, but what are some of the external factors that we need to keep in mind with change?
I think there's so many. The one that I hear a lot from people that I interview is different departments not talking to each other. So people in operations are pulling together an amazing change plan. They put a lot of thought and effort into it. They're about to hit go, and they found out that day, IT is rolling out a new system, and we haven't been talking to each other, because there's often a lack of that central figure that brings people together. I think internal comms, or comms in general, can be that person that sees the bigger picture and kind of help people to prioritize. So I think understanding what's going on in the rest of the business is one. I think thinking about organizational energy levels, are you about to launch a business critical change at a time at the end of the financial year and people are just feeling spent and don't have a lot of capacity? Like, just doing a bit of a sense check of where people are. There's a bunch of frameworks that can use to do that at a team level, potentially, because different teams will have different experiences and have different, appetites for change and abilities to take it on. And thinking about, business critical times, I mentioned end of financial year. It'd be a terrible idea to roll out a change for your finance team around the end of financial year, because they need to be focusing on other things. Your sales team, don't bother them too much if they have crazy KPIs to meet and they are trying to hustle on them and get to them at the final hour. Like, don't ask them to do a piece of training that's not critical at that moment. They just need to be able to kind of keep their eyes on the target. So thinking about how we can keep the rhythms of business moving along, not put any of our business critical outcomes at risk, but also, bring the change in when, the critical change, when people are going to be most receptive to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really great lesson. I really like that, you reiterated that role that internal comms plays. I know, when I was in internal comms in in-house roles, we really did have that helicopter view. And we ended up being the people sort of going, oh, hang on, did you know that such and such in HR is also doing that? And you do end up being that connector if there's no EPMO or any sort of function like that is actually overseeing what goes on. And even when you do have an EPMO, they don't know everything. So sometimes you end up informing them too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also, it's about, we don't always value ourselves as communicators, as people that are just good at connecting. Like, I think it's inherent in everybody, but it's actually a skill that is kind of sought after, and not everyone has it. That ability to just even ask the question of, hey, have you talked to Jane about this yet? Because I think Jane's doing something. Like, people don't necessarily jump there automatically, and comms experts do because we're inherently curious. So I think, yeah, it's about valuing that part of our skill set as well.
Now, speaking of curious, I have one final question for you on this topic. And it's about AI, because it is a big part of our worlds now. It's becoming bigger. It's only going to get bigger. What are some of the ways you're seeing organizations adapt AI to support change in communication?
I think the AI question for me is more about how businesses are talking about AI, because I think in some ways in some respects it's working against them. So in COVID, we think about how businesses were addressing their workforce. It was really about, what do you guys think? We want you to help us come up with better ways to work. Help us think about how to connect you and bring our culture alive in a virtual environment. Come up with all these cool ideas. And so, people were feeling very consulted. They were feeling really informed. Their ideas were getting action pretty quickly because we had to work in this very agile manner. And then, fast forward to the start of ChatGPT. I mean, I know AI is much bigger than that, but people always go to ChatGPT. This comes on the scene, and there's a period of time where employees pretty quickly change. They're like, oh, cool, we have this tool now. This tool is going to be everything we need to help us, reach our pretty lofty growth goals and streamline everything and blah, blah, blah. But then again, to go back to Gartner, you look at their research and their kind of what they call the AI hype cycle. And it suggests that we're still 2 to 5 years away from this technology actually delivering those gains that business leaders are kind of pinning a lot of hopes onto. And so the risk there is you've got this organizational apathy running through your organization. You've told employees, hey, we don't need you because we've got AI, which isn't what you said, that might be what they heard. And, things are going to fall through the cracks. So I don't think, again, like that there will be some businesses that are using AI really effectively. I think it's still quite early days. And I think we're still figuring out that relationship between human and robot.
That's very true. Absolutely. Well, Kate, thank you for all those insights. I've got 3 questions I ask every guest on the podcast. Are you ready for those?
Sure, go for it.
Let's do it. What's one of the best communication lessons you've ever learned, and how did it change the way you approach communication?
I love this question. So a guy called Don Price, who works at Atlassian, said this to me, and someone said this to him. So this is third-hand advice, but now fourth-hand, fifth-hand, people pass it on. That's how advice works. It's you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So listen more than you talk. It's the best way to kind of deeply understand the challenge you're trying to solve, or the communication approach that you should take. And so for me, when I heard him say that, I was like, absolutely. And so I've been talking a lot in this podcast, but, if we were just having a regular chat, I would try and listen and ask questions more than I speak, because I think that's where the gold lies. And that's where you have to sometimes listen for what's not said to get to the root of a problem.
And certainly in your role as essentially a journalist, that's critical, isn't it? You have to listen to understand and to ask good questions. Thank you for that. Next question. What's one thing you wish people would do more of or less of when communicating?
I think in the context of what we spoke about today, I think probably the stability piece, to giving equal weight when you're talking about in the context of change, give equal weight to what's changing and what's not changing, and make that a 50-50 so that it's a constant reminder for you of its importance and of the value that will have when you're trying to make change happen.
I love it. And final question, and in your role, you get to talk to so many amazing practitioners across HR, comms, change, all the lot. But who do you turn to for communication advice?
who do I turn to for communication advice? I've mentioned Gartner a lot, but that's more for inside advice. But there is a guy at Gartner called Aaron McEwen who I would recommend everyone follow on LinkedIn. He's great. He posts a lot of really interesting insights. So he's someone I would go to for insights. Communication advice. Shelley Johnson is a host of a podcast called This Is Work, and she is a founder of a consultancy called Boldslide. I think she's an excellent communicator. If you think about communicating through social channels and digital, she is. You probably know her, Mel. She kind of
I follow her on Instagram.
Yeah, she communicates really complex stuff really quickly and easily and in video format. And that is the future of communications. People do not have attention spans for anything more than that. And I think she's a master at what she does. So she's someone I would turn to think about how to get a message across quickly and effectively.
Love it. Okay, thank you so much for your time today. If people want to connect with you, find out more about you, what's the best way to reach you?
I'm on LinkedIn all the time. So connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love the opportunity to hear how change is going on in your business. And if you've got interesting case studies and stories, reach out and we can chat about how to tell more people about it.
Brilliant. And we'll put a link in the show notes to Kate's LinkedIn profile and to that slide that she mentioned as well. Kate, thank you so much for being on Let's Chat and More Matter.